This is the Lian Li PC A51. We're going to modify it and turn it into a clown car of PC components. So our previous editor rig was a Haswell i5, which is not bad, gets the job done, but we found the horsepower somewhat lacking of late. So, wanted to put together a new editor machine. Now the problems that we ran into with the Haswell i5 is that it was a micro ATX and it did not have enough PCI Express connectivity or expansion slots. So even though Skylake is a thing and Skylake is pretty good bang for the buck, it does not have enough horsepower to do what we want. That really means that we need to go X99. The Lian Li A51 is a case that I've had for a while. We did a review months ago. Hopefully I remember to link that in the description. But I like this case because it is a really compact ATX case. It's one of the most compact and travel-worthy ATX cases that there is on the market, but it's also got a certain aesthetic. You know, Lian Li, they're master aluminum metal workers. They produce really high-quality, top-shelf components. You don't really see people doing terrible things to Lian Li cases very often. So I figured, hey, why not get out the hacksaw and let's modify this thing? The thing that I don't like about the A51 is that the power supply is in the front and you don't have a choice about where to put it. So I decided to change that, but more on that in a moment. Let's take a look at the components we're going to put in this thing. So for our motherboard, we're going to use the ASUS Sabertooth X99. The reason we're using the Sabertooth X99 is because it's got the heat shield, it's got the assist fan. It's a really solid X99 motherboard that has a lot of flexibility. I've had some Linux compatibility issues with this motherboard, but with the updated UEFI, it's been mostly stable, although I haven't tried to use all the integrated peripherals on the motherboard under Linux yet. But for an editor workstation for video capture, it's actually been really well. So I've sort of already tested out this hardware, but not in this exact configuration, to see how it would do from an editing standpoint. For the CPU, we're using the Intel 5960X. You know, Skylake is nice, but the 5960X is 8 cores. You can also overclock it to just about 4 gigahertz. So yeah, I mean, Skylake's got nothing on that. 8 cores. Also the PCI Express lanes. So it turns out we need a lot of PCI Express connectivity if we're going to do video capture. I mean, the video capture cards that we're using are multi-lane PCI Express capture cards. So we need to give them as much bandwidth as we possibly can. We also want the system to be as portable as possible, even though it is full ATX, knowing that micro ATX just didn't have enough connectivity for us the first time around. So A51 seemed like a good fit, almost a perfect fit. For the RAM, we're going to be using the Vengeance LPX DDR400, also from Corsair. For the power supply, we're going to be using the Corsair RM1000i. And for the cooling, for the CPU, we're going to use the GTX 110i. Now the GTX 110i is a super ridiculous cooler. It is probably overkill considering that we are not going to overclock the 5960X to an extreme amount because this is an editor machine. However, because the A51 is a relatively compact case, we really wanted a high performance cooling solution because most of the exhaust air from the case is going to be carried through the GTX 110i's radiator or through the power supply exhaust. That's pretty much all of the exhaust air for the entire case going through those two sets of fans. So we really wanted something that was high performance. We think we probably could have gotten away with a single, 140 millimeter radiator and had a little bit more room. For example, in this case, when we're using the larger radiator, it blocks the 5¼ inch bay, which might have been nice for a memory card reader. We can probably still get a memory card reader in there because it's not super compact, but I'm going to have to hack down an Intermax memory card reader in order to be able to do that because Intermax has got a really nice memory card reader that will fit there almost. The reason it doesn't is because the plastic housing is a little different. So if you have a 3D printer and you're familiar with 3D modeling custom stuff, stay tuned because I'm going to need you in a minute. So for the build here for the editor, the 980 Ti is a really good choice. It's mostly a gaming card. I mean, honestly, for video acceleration and video editing, something like a Quadro would probably be a better choice, but they're ludicrously expensive. I also haven't figured out how to mod these cards to make them behave like Quadros. That worked really well on the 8800 GTX. You could totally mod the 8800 GTX into a Quadro. It was a really easy thing to do. It's not quite as easy as it used to be. If anybody has any details on modding the 980s into something that would run like as if it were a Quadro, let me know in the comments. Thanks. So the Corsair RM1000 is a really good choice for this build too. We may actually end up putting 2 graphics cards in this rig for various reasons, especially if we're booted into Linux, because then we can share one of the graphics cards with a Windows virtual machine if we need to run the Adobe Creative Suite. Although we're doing okay with Blender. I mean, Blender's not bad for video editing. It's getting there. The other thing is that we've got 3 PCI Express peripherals we've got to add. We've got our Plextor 512GB M.2 drive. We've got our Blackmagic Intensity Pro 4K capture card. Now this capture card is Linux friendly. It can be a little flaky. It's got a built-in fan that does not ramp up to the appropriate speed, so the card will hang or lock up sometimes. And I don't know why it doesn't ramp up the fan like it should. It's really annoying. They were supposed to have fixed that. They said they fixed that. It is not actually fixed. So capture on Linux is always just sort of problematic and really kind of frustrating. Overall, though, it does work on Linux. It works pretty well. I've also got the AverMedia Live Gamer HD, which does not work on Linux, at least not that I've been able to get it to work on Linux and actually be stable, but it works pretty well. Now, the AverMedia Live Gamer HD can capture 30 frames per second at 1080p, while the Blackmagic Pro 4K can capture 60 frames per second at 1080p and 30 frames per second at 4K. So this should really help us get some content together and do some stuff. Maybe I can upgrade my GH3. I don't know. We'll see what happens, because I've got a GH3, which is 1080p 60 FPS, which is how you've been enjoying these 60 FPS videos lately. I mean, who knew? It's a 60 FPS thing. This is, I'm actually capturing this on the machine. See, it's already done. I'm telling you guys about the past, but you guys think it's currently happening. I don't know. All right, so let's talk about the case mod. We're looking at the PCA 51 from Lian Li. This is actually a really smart design. It's reverse airflow, meaning that the airflow comes in the front and goes out the back, at least in the default configuration. Now, Lian Li does set it up so you can change the fans around to be anything you want, but the one thing you can't change, or at least not without a hacksaw, is where the power supply is located. So the power supply is in the front. It's got this little recessed bracket thing so that you can get the power cable in there, and it's got this little short power cable that routes the power connection from the back to the front. Now, this is the problem. The reason this is a problem is because with this power supply installed, you can only get one graphics card in here. A second graphics card will impact the power supply. Also, if you've got a large power supply, as the RM1000 happens to be, it will sort of bang against the front of the motherboard. They sort of share the same space. This is bad. Now, the reason Lian Li has done this is to give you maximum flexibility for your CPU cooler. The only other place you could put a power supply, I think, and actually have it work and be sane, would be up near the CPU, basically turned vertically above the CPU. The problem is that if you're going to use a tower cooler, you don't have room for a tower cooler. But we've got the GTX 110 from Corsair as well. So we're going to use the GTX 110 as our CPU cooler. We're going to put the radiator in the top of the case, and that leaves plenty of room over the CPU. Actually, we kill 2 birds with 1 stone, because a lot of the time when you've got a motherboard that's got an all-in-one cooler, some motherboard designs take into account that they're going to have, you know, airflow from the fans on the tower cooler around the CPU socket. And so if you use an all-in-one cooler, your VRM or your memory or other components may not get the cooling that they otherwise expected from having a fan somewhere around the CPU. Well, because we're going to use the RM1000i and we're going to mount it this way, there's going to be plenty of airflow over the motherboard. That's also another reason that we chose the Sabertooth X99, because it's got the assist fan designed specifically for cooling its components. It also has 11 different temperature sensors that are scattered all over the motherboard, as well as auxiliary temperature input sensors, and so we can use that to monitor the temperature of the system to make sure that it's not overheating. If we're going to use this as a portable-ish but powerful editing rig that has hardware HDMI capture with low latency HDMI capture is the name of the game, and in order to do that you need gobs of bandwidth. USB capture tends to add at least 500 milliseconds of delay just because of the processing overhead, although we have been able to source a couple of things from China that actually have relatively low processing overhead that are USB 3, but it can still be a little bit weird and a little bit problematic to get those working. I myself still prefer the PCI Express video capture for lowest latency, but I may be able to be convinced that USB capture would be the way to go in the future sometimes. But if you have a lot of inputs, I'm not really sure that that's going to work out. But the Sabertooth also has the 10 gigabit USB, so that will be an option for us as soon as those kinds of solutions are on the market and we're able to actually get our hands on one and play with it. So immediately we're talking about 3 PCI Express peripherals: the M.2, the 2 capture cards, and then our graphics card. And if we add a second graphics card, we've basically used not all, but almost all of the PCI Express slots in this particular case. And actually the PCI Express configuration on this motherboard for that is a little bit problematic, because some of the PCI Express lanes are shared with the M.2. So in the configuration that we would normally go with, where we've got the 2 capture cards and we've got you know, our two PCI Express peripherals in the default way that you would set that up with these multi-lane cards, it will not actually work with the Sabertooth X99 just because of the way that they've got the PCI Express lanes routed. We can still make it work, but in terms of like best airflow and best arrangement of cards, the best setup on this particular motherboard is going to be our 3 PCI Express peripherals and a single graphics card, and that second graphics card would be a little bit of a challenge to get working in this case with both of our capture cards and our PCI Express M.2. So just FYI if you're looking to build a system like this. Now, in order to move the power supply bracket is really the key to the operation here. We've got this nifty fan in the back of the case. Basically, we're just going to take the fan hole and make it a little bit larger with a hacksaw and reuse that power supply bracket from the front. Now, Lian Li actually could probably take this into account in a future design. Maybe this might be an option to give somebody, you know, a different bracket or some kind of an option to move the power supply from the front to the back, depending on what they're doing. Now, you're not going to want to do that if you've got a tower CPU cooler, if that's what you're using. But if you're using an all-in-one closed loop cooler or something like that, then you could totally do that with this kind of a setup. The other neat thing that this frees up is if you wanted to use a graphics card that had a closed loop all-in-one cooler, that totally would be an option. You could totally mount one of those in here and mount the cooler in the front. And that to me is the mind-blowing thing. So we've got the PCA 51, we've got the 1000 watt power supply, we've got all this stuff in here, and there's still room in this case for a second closed loop cooler, for example, for a graphics card. Now, most graphics cards that use the closed loop all-in-one cooler use a 120mm fan. The fan in the front is 140mm, and so you would need to get an adapter or 3D print an adapter for the fan if you're going to run a 120mm fan in the front. But you could do a closed loop cooler for your graphics card and a closed loop cooler for your CPU and move the power supply and have a second non-closed loop graphics card in, you know, SLI or Crossfire in this case and be completely fine. And that to me is mind-blowing. That is a clown car. It is just solid components, but this is a full ATX system in what is in the same size case as what is normally a micro ATX system. So I like having the PCI Express connectivity. It's really awesome. And I think for the video capture needs that I have and the video editing, this rig is going to be way, way better. I really had a blast trying to put this thing together. The only problems that I really ran into is that the really awesome braided tubing on the GTX 110i is so large and unflexible. I had a little bit of trouble cramming it in there with the power supply, but there was just barely enough room to do that. So if you're going to do this and you use a closed loop cooler that has smaller closed loop tubing, then I think you'll be a little bit better off. But it still fits, it's still completely fine. And there is actually a reasonable amount of room between the power supply and the motherboard. And the power supply fan only helps exhaust heat from the motherboard and the surrounding areas and helps airflow over the RAM. So that actually works out really well. Now the other thing with these braided tubes is that it sort of blocks your 3.5-inch bays at the front. There is room for you to get one 3.5-inch drive at the bottom here, but these braided tubes are just so large I didn't feel comfortable trying to cram in another 3.5-inch drive in the front here. But there is actually enough room at the front here for another closed loop all-in-one cooler if you get rid of the 3.5-inch bays altogether. And if I really want to make this look nice, I'll 3D print some kind of a bracket to hide my awful, you know, hand tool work with a with a hacksaw. Yes, I have a CNC machine and I could have done a way better job, but 30 minutes, it's like 8-minute abs, 30-minute case mods. I don't know what to tell you. What's better than 8-minute abs, 7-minute abs? I don't know. Now the final piece of the puzzle that's missing is mounting 3.5-inch bays. Now, because this is an editor and video capture machine, I'd love to use all SSDs, but it ain't gonna happen. We need lots of mechanical storage. In order to do that, I've sort of borrowed a hard drive cage from another case, and I've just sort of thrown it in the front, called it a day. It's like, that's good enough. We'll just tack it down. It'll be fine. But this is the other 3D printing thing. So if there's anybody in the audience, you're still with me, and you do 3D modeling, and you would like to do something, head on over to the forums at techsyndicate.com. What I'm thinking is it might be fun to see if anybody in the audience wants to design a 3D printable hard drive cage that'll hold two 3.5-inch hard drives that will work with the existing holes and layout at the front of the Lian Li case here. I think it might be best if the hard drives could be turned vertically instead of horizontally. I think there's enough room to do that under the fan. And there's also this rectangular hole in the front of the case, and so we could reuse that somehow. But I'm not really sure exactly what I would do for mounting 3.5-inch bays at the front here. but I feel like that if I tinkered with it long enough, I would probably come up with something pretty cool. But I don't really care about it that much, and so if it bothers you, or it's something you want to help out with, or it's something you want to see me tweet about, then head to the forums at techsyndicate.com, and there should be technical specs for this case on Lian Li's website, and if you want to take a stab at doing something, then message me on the forums and let me know. The only other 3D printable things that I can think of that might be handy for this case is some kind of a bracket to hide my awful handiwork at the back of the case where I cut out the hole for the rectangular power supply, and maybe some kind of a bracket or something to hold the front edge of the power supply, maybe something that latches onto the top and bottom of the case just to prevent it from moving around when carrying the computer around, or if I set it down too hard or whatever, because I don't want the only mount point for the power supply to be just those 4 screws, since those 4 screws are now carrying weight, and in the original Lian Li design, those screws were really just holding the power supply to the bottom of the case, and the bottom of the case really carried most of the weight of the power supply. It's a little bit the case that the bracket was not engineered to hold that kind of weight, especially when you're moving the case around, and so I'll need to do something to address that problem. The other big feature of this build is that the RM1000i power supply from Corsair, because it's got the USB link, lets me customize the fan behavior. So I'm able to ramp up the fan a little bit more than the power supply would ordinarily be on its own in order to assist with cooling in this case. So if you look at it, we've got the fan in the front, and that's our intake. And then we've got the 2 fans on the closed loop radiator and the fan in the power supply. Between the power supply and the closed loop radiator, those fans exhaust all of the warm air from this case. And the fan in the front brings in fresh air from the front. I'm not sure yet if the PCI Express peripheral area is getting enough airflow. I may end up having to try to put a fan down there or mount one in the bottom of the case. There is actually an option to mount a fan in the bottom of the case, but it will interfere with the very last expansion slot on the motherboard. So that's something that I maybe still need to take a look at. But overall, I'm very satisfied with the build. It was a lot of fun to put together, and I hope you really enjoyed looking at it as we sort of went through it together. This is our new X99 editor build. It's got top shelf components in it. If you're thinking about building something like this, or you have any questions, head on over to the forums at techsyndicate.com. I'm Wendell, I'm signing out, and I'll see you there.